For the last 2 decades, I've had the privilege of being involved in the fine and performing arts. I've been a student, a performer, an artist and an advocate, a director, designer, an organizer. And in all those iterations involved in the arts, we come across very common problems. One of the most common complaints is always that there's a lack of funding or community support. Now, this idea always baffled me, and that why would we work so hard to acquire something, but yet never plan to fund it or support it? And then several years ago, while discussing a land acquisition project with a city for a future art space, the acquisition went up to vote. And it was a very exciting time because the vote passed, and the city was going to acquire this future art space. When I asked the city what the plan was to fund and support that future art space, the city told me that there was none. When I asked why, they said that when they went to vote for it, the community didn't see the value in it, and they voted against it. That's when I realized that the true threat to the arts wasn't really in the lack of funding or community support, but it was in understanding the value of funding and support for the arts. You see, it was easy for a community to go ahead and associate value to industry or technology. And it was easy for a city to go ahead and say, okay, we'll support funding for road services and social services and housing. But when it came to the arts, the problem was automatically the arts were put on the back burner. They considered the arts not integral to city planning. They considered the arts a luxury, something that didn't help with community growth. And this was a dangerous perception of its value. You see, because the data shows it's the complete opposite. When we fund and plan for funding arts in our communities, we end up having positive yields in education, economics, and increasing our cultural capital. So we take that and we say, okay, how is that applied? Well, the first one, in education. Let's take a look in a 2020 public school review that focused directly on the impact of funding the arts and early education. Starts with a statement saying that since the time of ancient Greece, philosophers such as Plato had insisted that the involvement of the arts and education was essential to society. And this holds true today for modern society as it does for ancient Greece, because 94% of Americans want arts education in their schools. Susan Rupert wrote an essay called Critical Evidence, associating the impact of arts on student achievement. And they found that when we implemented arts into education, there were rises in student achievement across various fields, including 6 different fields, the most important being a positive educational environment. Now, this is extremely important on itself because we exist now in a post-pandemic era. And right now, lowering things like student anxiety, addressing mental health, and finding pathways to make students more comfortable in learning environments is extremely important. What we found is that when we apply the arts to these environments and we lower those things, we see increases in the average GPA. We see increases in standardized testing scores, and we see a decrease in student dropout rates. These moves are important because it's a marginal shift from a student that could be a failure to a passing student. But more importantly, it takes somebody that goes from having no opportunity to an opportunity of higher education or better income. Now, in 1980, Johns Hopkins University did a study in St. Louis, Missouri. There were 8 cultural institutions that were being city-funded. They were interested on the impact economically, what was going on with those institutions. And what they found was really interesting because they wanted to divide it into 2 things: direct impact and secondary markets. The first one is about how much money was generated by funding these things directly. At the time, 1980, St. Louis was bringing in around $20 million, close to about $60 million in modern money now. But what was super important is in secondary markets, it was generating around $42 million. Now, $42 million not directly involved to the income that was coming in from those institutions. It was double. And out of that $42 million, $15 million went to employment and wages, supporting about 2,000 jobs in the area. These weren't jobs related to those institutions. These were hospitality jobs, transportation jobs, retail jobs, jobs that were funded because of the impact of those institutions. And this really shouldn't be that surprising. According to the National Endowment of the Arts, there's a contribution of arts to the US GDP of about $500 billion. In the state of Florida alone, $38.8 billion in 2019 was contributed by arts organizations and businesses. Out of that amount, $17 billion went to wages that supported about 261,000 jobs. That's an insane amount of jobs down here. And that contributed to about an average household income of those arts workers earning about 2.5 times the median household income. So, we know that the arts being supported in education create a better educational environment. And we know that when we support the arts, they're an economic driver. And these two things add to increased cultural capital. And cultural capital is a concept that was brought about in the late 1970s by French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. And it's an interesting idea that there's this currency that exists that allows for a people to move upwards socially by gathering these things in 3 different states. The first state is the embodied state. And in this state, we gather this currency through knowledge, understanding, and education. The more we learn, the more currency we earn. The second, which is where people have a tendency to relate to, is an objectified state. I earn more, therefore I can have a better life. I've earned more so I can afford better schools, better healthcare, better living, better opportunities. The third state, which is the most interesting to me, is an institutionalized state. And in this state, we move upwards socially through peer acceptance and title. So because I've earned more, and because I am more educated, I can become a doctor, or a professor, or I can be a philanthropist. I can commit more time to community organizations. I can support more things. And in this state, when all 3 are filled of that currency, a social mobility of going upward exists. You can take a marginalized community and move itself upward to an unmarginalized space. And this is really interesting because it happens all over the place currently right now with arts-based revitalization projects. Let's take, for example, the Wynwood District in Miami. See, Wynwood is located somewhere between Overtown and Little Haiti, kind of nestled in this spot where for a long time it was abandoned. It was filled with warehouses and homeless, high crime rates, high drug rates. But through proper city planning, a collaboration with contractors, land developers, and artists, they were able to put together a plan to revitalize the neighborhood to an art-based neighborhood. And Wynwood turns around and starts developing things like the famous Wynwood Walls, which express city art. And they create multiple art galleries, a Wynwood fashion district. Next thing you know, Wynwood moves up to one of the highest tourist attractions in South Florida. And the same thing is happening in cities all over the country. Detroit, Greenville, South Carolina has many of them. All over the place, in a post-recession era, we see revitalization movements by better funding in the arts. So, what does that mean entirely? It means that if we fund the arts, we have better education. If we fund the arts, we have better economics. With all these things, we increase this cultural capital. We can move ourselves forward as a community. So, if you really want to understand what's important to supporting the arts, it's about spreading that understanding of its value. You see, when we support the arts, we're not just supporting that, we're supporting community growth, access to better mental health, a pathway to understanding and moving communities forward. We also support the fact that we're looking at things that lower anxiety, increase cultural growth. Across the board, when you value the arts and understand valuing the arts, it in itself is creating cultural capital at that moment. So, I ask you all to please take the time to understand the value of the arts. Go ahead and support them. Look at them, and please, most absolutely, create it. Thank you.